The Technology History Podcast. Exciting stories about the development of technology by Christian Steinbach. Hi everybody, and welcome to episode number 6 in English of my Technology History Podcast. Before we get started, I would like to thank you very much for your interest in my podcast and for the positive feedback I have received. If you want to tell me something, just write it in the comments on Spotify or YouTube. And now we start with episode number 6 in English entitled Records, Part 1. People have always strived for faster, further, higher. It is deeply rooted in us to want to be the best. In the field of technology, this drive is a prerequisite for further developments. Because people were never satisfied with what they had achieved, they improved the technology that was already available to them with the aim of being even better. The pursuit of records, this is best performances that no one has ever achieved before, is of particular importance here. An important aspect is the public aspect. This is the fact that setting a record only makes sense if it is not done in private, but in front of people who witness the achievement and then celebrate the hero. The Guinness Brewery in Ireland, for example, recognized the advertising effectiveness of such ventures. The Guinness Book of Records has been published annually since 1955. Guinness World Records is now an independent company. It is the institution when it comes to recognizing and certifying new records. This costs a lot of money, and you have to comply with a lot of regulations designed to ensure that everything is fair. However, fame and advertising effectiveness make up for these hurdles. In this episode and the next one, I would like to present some records and record hunts that are particularly interesting for the development of technology. It is difficult to say where the transport system would be if a large number of daring people had not always tried to exploit the possibilities of the vehicles of their time and finally to advance into new dimensions with new developments. The thrill of speed was already popular in ancient times, in the form of horse-drawn chariot races. The highlight was certainly the races in the Circus Maximus in Rome. Although they have been dead for almost 2000 years, we still know the names of the most successful and famous drivers today, such as Flavius Corpus and Gaius Diocles. The first spectacular automobile record was set in the three-emperor year of 1888 by Bertha Benz, the wife of the car developer Carl Benz. 2 years earlier, he had presented his petrol-powered three-wheeler, but had not been able to convince the public of the usefulness of the car. Bertha Benz wanted to achieve this with a spectacular venture. And so she drove with her 2 sons from Mannheim to Pforzheim and thus undertook the first ever long-distance automobile journey. The venture was not entirely without incident. Bertha Benz had to clear a blocked fuel line with her headpin and buy fuel from a pharmacy in Wiesloch. Of course, there were no gas stations yet. With this 100-kilometer journey, which took them just under 13 hours, Bertha Benz and her sons not only achieved a brilliant advertising coup for Carl Benz's car. You can also say that the 3 of them also set the first record for cars with an average speed of 7.7 kilometers per hour over 100 kilometers. And it was not long before motorists succumbed to a real speed frenzy. Just 6 years later, the first car race went from Paris to Rouen, and another 12 years later, the first circuit race was held in France. Setting new speed records also became a symbol of the ever faster developing industrial societies. The International Automobile Federation (FIA) took on the role of referee and set the rules. From then on, only the records set under these conditions were officially recognized. The first documented record dates back to 1898 and was set by the Frenchman Chasseloup Lobat with an electric vehicle. The speed was almost 63 km per hour. And less than half a year later, in April 1899, the 100 km per hour mark was already broken. The Belgian Camille Genassi also managed this with an electric car. When you see the pictures of this strange bomb-shaped structure with its carriage-like chassis, it is hard to believe that Genassi had the courage to accelerate it to almost 106 km per hour. In 1906, 8 years before the outbreak of the First World War, the American Fred Marriott managed to drive a steam car faster than 200 km per hour, faster than most of us have ever driven in a car. The location of the event was Daytona Beach in Florida. Daytona Beach is known to every motorsport fan, as numerous racing events were later held here. 22 years later, on 5/23/1928, a new speed record was set by a rocket vehicle for the first time. Fritz von Opel reached 238 km per hour on the Avus racetrack in Berlin. 1/28/1938 was tragic. On the A5 highway between Frankfurt and Darmstadt, Mercedes driver Rudolf Caracciola managed to increase the record to 432.7 km per hour. Bernd Rosemeyer then took to the track in his Auto Union vehicle after Caracciola had warned him of gusts of wind. At over 400 km per hour, Rosemeyer lost control and paid for the record chase with his life. After the Second World War, enthusiasm for speed records in the automotive sector seems to have waned considerably. It would be 32 years before the next truly remarkable event occurred. In October 1970, dragster driver Gary Gabelich achieved the first speed of over 1,000 km per hour on the Bonneville Salt Flats in Utah, USA. His vehicle, the Blue Flame, had nothing to do with a conventional automobile. It was, both visually and technically, a horizontal rocket supported by 3 wheels, powered by liquid natural gas and hydrogen peroxide. The blue flame that came out gave rise to the name Blue Flame. It is on display in the Auto- und Technikmuseum in Sinsheim, Germany, where I admired it as a child with my father and grandfather. In a similar vehicle, the Budweiser rocket, Stan Barrett achieved the first supersonic ride 9 years later in 1979, although this was not recognized as an official record. The first official supersonic ride was achieved by the Englishman Andy Green with a thrust SSC 20 years later in 1997. It is noteworthy that the aircraft had already literally surpassed the automobile in terms of speed during the First World War. What Gary Gabelich only managed to do with the Blue Flame in 1970, breaking the 1,000 km per hour mark, was already achieved by the German test pilot Heini Dietmar with an Mi-163 rocket fighter in 1941. An interesting duplication is that the Mi-163 also used hydrogen peroxide as an oxidizing agent. This turned out to be difficult to handle and dangerous, especially when the Mi-163 was deployed at the front. Mano Ziegler, one of the few pilots who flew the Mi-163, described an accident in his book in which a crash landing resulted in the aggressive pure hydrogen peroxide pouring into the cockpit and dissolving the pilot before he could be rescued. But back to speed. As early as 1947, the American test pilot Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier with the X-1 rocket plane. The last absolute world speed record with an aircraft was set in 1967 by William Knight with the X-15 rocket plane. Knight reached over 7,000 km per hour. But the airspace had also become too small for absolute world speed records. From now on, we have to think in terms of space travel. The Soviet-Russian Yuri Gagarin already reached a speed of about 28,000 km per hour during his first manned space flight in April 1961. However, since 1969, the honor of holding the absolute world speed record for humans has belonged to the crew of Apollo 10, astronauts Tom Stafford, Eugene Cernan and John Young, who reached the legendary speed of around 40,000 km per hour on their return flight from the Moon to Earth. But unmanned space travel is even faster. The Parker Solar Probe, which is currently exploring the Sun, is probably the fastest man-made object. It orbits the Sun at an unimaginable speed of over 600,000 km per hour. This was the episode number 6 in English of the Technology History podcast entitled Records, Records, Records Part 1, in which we looked at the record hunt in terms of speed. I will report on further technical records next week in the second part. If you enjoyed the podcast, I would be very happy about a subscription. And maybe you know someone who is also interested in this topic and to whom you would like to recommend my podcast. Finally, my thanks go to Walk-In Music from Pixabay, whose song I was allowed to incorporate into the intro. Thank you for your interest and see you next time on the Technology History Podcast.